And we are live, so feel free to get us started.
Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. I am Janice Sykes-Ross, the Executive Director here at the West Philadelphia Cultural Alliance Paul Robeson House and Museum. So thank you so much for taking this wonderful, gorgeous Sunday afternoon to be with us. We realized that you could be outside enjoying today, but we felt like this is really important programming. And so we do not take it for granted. And so I offer greetings to all of you. Thank you again for being here with us. I just wanted to briefly tell you a little bit about the museum. The museum is going to be open now from Thursday through Saturday. So we're grateful that we are finally open. We're asking that if you'd like to tour the museum, and that information will be in the chat for you to make an appointment. And you can do that via our website, or you can call us directly. And our phone number also will be in the chat. The museum highlights the years of Paul Robeson's life with stories and pictures of his family, friends, and the many acquaintances. This is the house he lived in for the last 10 years of his life. The new exhibit that we have, so if you've been here before, understand that we have a new exhibit now, and it's called Paul Robeson, His Movies, His Music, and His Message. When you come into the new exhibit, you will be transformed into a theatrical setting where we will feature his film career, his stage career, and of course, his music career, which most people are familiar with. But I want to talk about today's series. Today's program is part of our Parlor Talk series. And today is one of our first programs that we will be featuring in this series. The series really is going to be highlighting poets, artists, collectors of art, authors, lecturers, historians, poets, and storytellers, and more. And of course, all of you. With this series, we're going to ask that the audience engage with us so that you will be a part of this process as well. And now I want to introduce to you and present to others and introduce to some, Miss Adrienne Whaley. Adrienne G. Whaley is an educator, a history lover, who currently serves as the Director of Education and Community Engagement at the Museum of the American Revolution. Adrienne earned her bachelor's degree in African American Studies from Harvard University and her master's in education from the University of Pennsylvania. She has worked in both art and history museums, including the Museum of Modern Art in New York City, the African American Museum here in Philadelphia, and the Smithsonian's Anacostia Community Museum, and loves the potential for objects, artifacts, and primary source of documents to enrich students' learning, to enrich the students' learning experiences. She carries her love of history and for uncovering the stories of common people into her spare time as an avid genealogist, researching her own family history, and as president of the Philadelphia's African American Genealogy Group. As both a museum educator and as a genealogist, she's been presented on television and in workshops and conferences, both locally and nationally. So we are honored to have such an esteemed person with us. Welcome, Adrienne.
Thank you so much, Janice. And frankly, I'm honored to be here. It is a pleasure to be back inside of the Paul Robeson House. It's been a little while since I've been back here, but it is as beautiful as ever, if not more. And I'm frankly very excited for this program that we are diving into this afternoon. So you all heard a lot about me, but I promise that really is it, because the bulk of this program is actually about the wonderful woman who is sitting beside me, Joyce Mosley. Now, Joyce and I have known each other for many years because both of us are members of Philadelphia's African American Genealogy Group. And so I know Joyce exactly as you all are about to discover her. She is a passionate, excited advocate for telling the stories of her family history, which, as it turns out, include the history of this city's Black community, that include the history of this entire city, and frankly, that encompass the history of the nation. And the reason why we are sitting here inside of the Paul Robeson House is because this family story that Joyce has been lifting up directly connects to the story of Paul Robeson, who is a member of her family tree. So I'm really excited for this conversation that we're about to have. Now, Joyce started researching her own family history because she came to it honestly through her grandmother, who was a collector of the oral histories of her family. And so she asked Joyce to start pulling together the documentary evidence to support those stories. They knew that there was a lot of truth there, but what would the documents tell them? How would they add to the story? How would they enrich it? And so for over 25 years at this point, Joyce has been digging into that research, and you all are going to learn a lot about the process and some of the fascinating people that are in her family tree as we talk over the course of this afternoon. And the reason why we are here together today, not only because she's got this amazing history that ties into Paul Robeson, but because Joyce is a newly published author. And so you all can see on screen behind us, but also on the table here, Joyce's book, Graham's Gift. And that is what we are going to be chatting about this afternoon. Now, I hope that everybody has already picked up a copy. If you all have not picked up a copy, don't worry, because we're going to provide lots of opportunities over the course of this program to tell you how to get your hands on one. You definitely need to pick it up. It's a fascinating read, both in terms of the history that it shares, but also just as a way of understanding how one person has chosen to share their family story with the world. So Joyce, thank you so much for being with us this afternoon.
Thank you for that lovely introduction. I appreciate that.
Absolutely. So let's jump right in. Okay, so why did you write Graham's Gift? What can other people take from this story?
So there's several reasons. One, my grandmother asked me to document our history. She knew her oral history, and she knew out there that there are many historians in our family. I mean, one of Cyrus's granddaughters hand wrote an 18-page biography.
And when you say Cyrus, who's Cyrus?
Okay, so thank you for that. So Cyrus Bustill is my 7th great grandfather. We'll talk about him a little bit later in some detail. But as I said, his granddaughter hand wrote an 18-page biography in 1825 about her grandfather that she never met. She was born the year he died, but she'd heard family stories. She'd seen evidence of his life, and she wanted to put it down on paper. And from that point on, almost every generation of my family has documented our story.
That is awesome. And I want to tell you all, so you all are going to hear Joyce share a lot of really interesting pieces of information, both about her family history, as well as her process and other people's process for doing the research. So as you hear things that are interesting to you, if you come up with questions, go ahead and type them into the chat, because we will be paying attention to it. We're going to have time to answer a lot of questions at the end, but if we see something that's really relevant to what we're talking about in the moment, then we will try to lift that up and get that question answered or that comment responded to. So feel free to make active use of the chat. So Joyce, this is called Graham's Gift. Is there a real Graham who is telling this story? And if not, who is this story's perspective from?
Graham is really a composite of my mother, my grandmother, and my great-grandmother. For an example, the kids in the book are all the grandchildren, the great-grandchildren, and the great-grandson of my mother. So, which was exciting, which drew the kids in. In fact, my great nephew said to me, because he's on the cover of the book and he's mentioned in the book, he asked me if he was a celebrity because he had so much buzz going around the family. But so Graham's Gift is really written from the children's point of view. So there's a 10-year-old boy that is narrating the story. And I never put in his gender, but I always call him him. So I figured he's a boy. And he's 10 years old because he tells us in the book he's 10 years old. And I just want to read this passage, which is one of my favorite pieces in the book. And it starts out, just as Graham was about to tell us about the 8 Bustill children, Mom came and said, okay, kids, It's time to go to bed. You will have to continue your history lesson tomorrow. We asked if we could just have 5 more minutes. Please, Mom, just 5 more minutes. But Mom said no. So off to bed we went. I laid in my bed feeling sad because Cyrus is the same age that I am now when he was sold away from his family. I couldn't wait to hear the rest of the story. I fell asleep thinking about what it must have been like to be somebody's property. So Cyrus was 10 when he was sold away from his family, and the little boy that's telling the story is 10.
And this is really powerful because I think all of us recognize that moment where you're caught up in a story, right? And you don't want to close the book. You want to just keep hearing, you want to keep hearing. And so you've got this oral history being passed down and he just wants to stay. He just wants to continue sitting there. Graham's hearing it.
Because Graham is a storyteller by profession. She writes books. So imagine sitting, and I've done this. I've actually sat with my grandmother and listened to her tell us a story, and there was a sense of pride in being a part of this family that Graham wanted to give her grandchildren. There's a sense of being, a sense of if you know your history. Maurice Garvey, I'll quote what he said, if a family knows, if the family doesn't know their history, they're like a tree without roots. And Graham wanted to give them roots. She wanted to give them their history.
And she's skilled at doing it because he's hanging on every word and just waiting for the next piece.
He can't wait to continue hearing the story.
Yeah. And the power in that, I think, is also that through the way that she's telling these stories, she's really supporting a sense of empathy within him. He is making the connection to what it would have been like to be Cyrus, who's the same age.
Right? And he's adopting the story as part of his life, his heritage, and that's important. And I think the other reason is that the kids get to tell the story by asking questions. So I tried to pull the kids into the story.
So maybe there's a lesson in that for everybody, which is maybe try not to lecture when we're sharing our family stories, but find ways of pulling people in, finding ways of getting them to connect emotionally to it, ask them questions, let them see those connections themselves. You're going to listen.
Especially children. Children want to be a part of something. So it's important to them that they see themselves in the story, and that's one of the reasons I wrote the book. The other one is my grandmother asked me to document our history, so I did. And for me, in these times we live in where they're trying to erase our history, they're trying to write us out of history, it's important that we as parents, grandparents, the community, teach our children our history.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely true. And I think especially for those of us who have the opportunity to still have our elders in the world around us, we need to be taking these opportunities to ask them the questions, get them to share those histories, recognizing that sometimes they're going to be painful, sometimes they're going to be challenging, but that there's something powerful within them that deserves to be passed on, even if they're difficult.
And if you don't have elders, if they've all gone on, talk to the people in your generation. They will remember something that you never knew. So that's one way of starting to record, starting to document your family's history.
And we'll come back to that a little bit later on. So your family tree is expansive. And there are many, many interesting stories in that. So for the purpose of today's conversation, you narrowed down the scope of the folks that you wanted to talk about to just 5 people, folks that you're going to share a little bit with us about in terms of their contributions to history, the things that they were able to accomplish despite the many challenges that people of African descent have. Tell me about these 5 people and help me to think about, like, where did their strength come from? How were they able to survive and even thrive in difficult circumstances? So where do you want to start?
I'm going to start with Cyrus Bustill because he was born in 1742. He was born enslaved because his mother was the property of his grandfather, which meant then he was the property of his grandfather. At age 10, his grandfather died and he was sold. So that was the first time he really felt that he was enslaved because he had to leave his mother, the people he loved, and he moved to another farm. So there's a connection there, I think, between Cyrus and some of the other history of their family, because for 20 years, he was the property of Judge John Allen, which meant for 20 years, he kind of either parented himself or the enslaved people on that farm took the responsibility of raising this 10-year-old boy. And I think we talk about strength, that's one of the places I think Cyrus gets his strength, and he passed that on to generations of his family. He was also very clear in the fact that he didn't want to have children until he was free. He was not going to add to enslaving his people. So at the age of 30, Cyrus was sold again to a second person, but this person apprenticed him to a bakery. So he learned to trade, he learned to bake, which impacted the rest of his life. In 1769, he was emancipated. He was a free man. He opened his own bakery. He was a pillar and respected in his community. And then during the Revolutionary War, he was commissioned to bake bread for the troops at Valley Forge. I haven't been able to prove this, but the oral history of my family says that George Washington actually gave him a silver dollar. I don't know what happened to the silver dollar. It's documented in the Quaker notes that the Quakers saw it, but we don't know what happened to it.
Interesting, but you have been able to document Cyrus's service in the Revolutionary War, which explains this image behind us. Can you say a little bit about the document?
Yes, and this is a document that his granddaughter actually was responsible for getting, and it authenticates the fact that Cyrus Bustill was commissioned to bake the bread with the flour that was sent to New Jersey. And because of this document, I'm a member of the Daughters of the American Revolution.
And that's a story that we will circle back to a little bit later on as well. Cyrus Bustill's story, I think, is a really interesting one, especially because I work at the Museum of the American Revolution, and so few people know of the many, 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 many contributions of people of African descent to the war effort. I mean, people often don't even think about the fact that approximately 1 out of every 5 people living in British North America on the eve of the American Revolution were people of African descent, people like Cyrus Bustill, right? People with knowledge, with skills, with abilities, with gifts to contribute to the world, if only they had the opportunity.
That's right. And that even the fact that people of African descent fought is something that most people don't know. And there were thousands of men on both sides that fought to protect this country or for the British. So there's that huge connection of our history that we don't know anything about.
And oftentimes those people who were fighting on both sides, somewhere around 5,000 to 8,000 for the revolutionary cause, and around 3 times as many on the British side, they were often fighting against each other while fighting for the same thing, right? Which was freedom, autonomy, the ability to decide their own futures.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So after the war, Cyrus moved to Philadelphia, and he moved with his family to Philadelphia. And he became a leader in that community. He was responsible for starting several Black churches. He was one of the founding members of the African Free Society, which helped runaways, which we don't call them runaways anymore. They're freedom seekers for self-emancipating themselves. And so there was a group in Philadelphia of free African Americans. I take that back. They were not African Americans. They were free people of African descent, because we weren't African Americans. We weren't citizens until the 13th Amendment. So we were people of African descent that used our resources to help other people that were enslaved or that were freedom seekers and moving through Philadelphia to freedom.
And so you mentioned earlier that Cyrus had made the decision early on that he was not going to have children while he was enslaved, because he did not want to be in that sort of a relationship with an enslaved woman that, because of her status, would then produce children who followed the status of their mother into slavery.
And he ended up actually marrying a free woman. whose grandfather was the first mayor of Philadelphia, Hiram Moray. And so he didn't continue that pattern, his family. His family was free very early on.
And so then tell me about the next generation, or who's the next person you want to share with us?
Grace Bustill.
Okay.
And Grace was a business owner. Can you imagine, in the late 1700s, the early 1800s, she actually operated a hat business, a millinery shop, and she catered mostly to Quaker women. And she lived and dressed and took on the mannerisms of a Quaker herself. She was raised Quaker, as was Cyrus Bustill's children. She continued that. She and her daughter, Sarah Maps Douglas, were both Quakers, and they suffered the humiliation of being told that they had to sit on the colored bench, on the Negro bench, at the Arch Street Meeting House for the Quakers. But she was she was educated, she and John.
And maybe, as I'm thinking about this, we might have do you have an image of that bench?
Yes, we do. If we can move there.
Okay.
So they were forced to sit in the very back of the meeting house. But she's very politically active, which at a time where women were not necessarily politically active. She was one of the founding members of the Female Anti-Slavery Act,
and that's the image we just had up.
Yes.
Yeah.
She was one of the founding members, along with her daughter, Sarah Maps Douglas.
So what does it mean to be a member of the Philadelphia Female Anti-Slavery Society? That seems like to be a member of that is to refuse to just be forced to sit in the back. It seems like it means to refuse to be told to be silent, to not cause a stir. What did that mean for her?
It was more of a political activist. She was upfront in trying to end slavery, as she was also upfront in trying to end discrimination against females. She was a suffragette as well as an abolitionist. She, at a time where women weren't supposed to participate in those kinds of activities, she was a leader. She was a trailblazer, along with her daughter, Sarah Maps Douglas, who was a teacher, started her own school for enslaved children at the age of 16. She got it.
What was I doing at the age of 16?
No, I wasn't thinking about anything like that. She was a teacher in Philadelphia for over 30 years. She was an artist.
And I think maybe we have some images of that artwork.
She was an artist along with her brother and some of her cousins. And Sarah also started the Female Literary Guild in Philadelphia. And if you are in the Philadelphia area, these art renditions and many of her other work is at the Philadelphia Library Company.
And so I know we saw the image of the bench that she and her family were relegated to when they were attending services. But there's another interesting image that I know that we have that I think ties directly into this conversation that we're having about family history and heritage and genealogy and all of that. So tell me about the newspaper that we have a copy of on the screen next.
We're going to bring it.
There we go.
So at a time, and again, Sarah Maps was such a force in the city. She was a genealogist. She kept the family history going. Interesting story about her was very late in life, she married the Reverend William Douglas, who was her cousin. His wife had died, he had 9 kids. She had never married, she never had any kids. And then all of a sudden, she was the stepmother for 9 kids, the first lady in a Presbyterian Episcopal church, who had always been a Quaker, lived a Quaker life. It was a huge, huge change in her life.
Sounds like she must have had a lot of fortitude.
She was a strong woman.
Sounds like it. And I'll just read a little piece of this to make sure folks know what it says. So let's see. She's been a teacher and lecturer for half a century and still follows that vocation, though in her 73rd year. So again, a woman of fortitude. Her pupils are scattered throughout the country from Maine to Georgia. Very few of them, however, are white. So she's teaching mostly students of African descent. Mrs. Douglas claims descent on her father's side from a Scotch nobleman, and she has her genealogy written out for several generations back. Her pedigree has a dash of Indian blood, and a former eminent lawyer of Allentown figures among her morganatic ancestors. Her maternal grandfather, Cyrus Bustill, was a Quaker. Oh, interesting. And again, this has a little bit of language we wouldn't normally use today, but this patriotic Negro served the country during the Revolutionary War as a baker. He baked all the bread used by the troops at Burlington, New Jersey, as is attested by a certificate to that effect dated May 1st, 1782. That's pretty fascinating.
That was a find. I mean, there are things as you do your genealogy and all of a sudden you'll find something and it just takes you in another direction. It is just such a significant find. And this was one of them.
That's pretty awesome. And you are continuing that legacy, obviously.
Yeah. And I am looking for the next generation that I can start to get involved because I've done so much work and I have so much documented. I don't want to lose this. So I'm already trying to find a replacement.
Which is why this book is kind of sneaky because you are sucking the next generation into this work. That's awesome. So let's see, who is our fourth person? Who do you want to tell us about next?
Okay, so David Bustill Bowser, that's a picture of him. He was an artist, a banner painter, volunteer firemen started here in Philadelphia and he painted their ceremonial hats. But he's noted for painting portraits, and he painted Abraham Lincoln's portrait and John Brown's portrait. John Brown's portrait was actually painted in David Bustill Bowser's living room as John Brown was renting a room in his house.
Wow.
And the house was also part of the Underground Railroad. So it was a stop there. The 11 United States Colored Troop Regimental
example of one of those things right now.
There's an example of the hats, the fireman hats. And then this is, as far as we know, the only surviving regimental flag out of the 11 that were painted. And this flag currently sits in a museum in Atlanta, Georgia.
And this is a pretty phenomenal flag. So I don't know if you all can see all of the detail on this. Like sort of era guard, but maybe represents Lady Liberty or something along those.
Yeah, Lady Liberty.
And she's holding a flag, it looks like, but she's holding that flag with a member of the United States Colored Troops. Yes, that's a pretty powerful statement.
Yes, and there are pictures of the other flags, and they are all statements. And this one just says it's the Colored Troops, but other ones say things like liberty or death. Actually, we will prove ourselves men or die.
We will prove ourselves men or die.
Yes, and the other 10 had similar statements. I mean, it's a sense of really pride. And he is third generation free descendant, African descendant. So that's pretty huge.
It makes me think of some of the anti-slavery artwork that you see as well that says things like, am I not a man and a brother?
Yes.
Yeah, we will prove ourselves men. That's really incredible. So let's see, there is another man in your family who I think would have been just as on board with powerful statements.
Exactly. I mean, you can see the pride through the generations. And you can see, even my grandmother would say to us as children, you know, that, and Graham says it in the book, go forward and be great. Your ancestors paved the way, so go forward and be great. And that's generation after generation in my family, we've done that, and we're proud to do that. So Paul Robeson is probably my most well-known cousin. He was a lawyer, an athlete, an activist, a linguist. He's spoken more than 20 languages and studied most of those.
It's probably easier to say what he didn't do.
That's right. He got his Phi Beta Kappa key at the end of his junior year. He was All-American. He played football, baseball, basketball, and ran track at Rutgers University, graduated valedictorian. He went to Columbia Law School, graduated with honors, got a job as a lawyer, but again, discrimination. His office as a lawyer was a former broom closet, and the white secretaries refused to take dictation from him. And it turns out that that was the best thing that could have happened, because that moved him from law into the theater and movies and concert stages and fighting justice for people around the world. He traveled all over the world. Anywhere where there was injustice, he was there. And he sung concerts around the world. He even temporarily stopped a war. During the Spanish-American War, the soldiers agreed that they would listen to his concert and stop fighting. I mean, how can you, I have such pride when I can tell these stories about my family.
I bet. And now young people have the opportunity, frankly, whether they're a member of your family or not, to feel that sense of pride, right? Because this story, your family history, is also just a story of people of African descent accomplishing things despite hardships. Is that part of why you wanted to write this book?
Absolutely, because I want to encourage other families. There are great people in everybody's family. My family is not the only one that has gone through and suffered and survived hardships. And any family can find that in their family. Any family can find that in their history. And the book highlights that. And so, yes, I encourage, and I really hope that the book is a step towards finding out other families' histories.
Now, this book is one way of preserving your family history and legacy, but you recently took another step that you alluded to previously in relation to the Daughters of the American Revolution. Would you tell us a little bit about that?
Yes, I decided to become a member of the Daughters of the American Revolution for two reasons. One is they have a very, very stringent application process. They are very, very good in going through all your documentation to verify it. So if they would verify my documentation, and especially the African American history, if they would verify that, then it adds value and credibility to my documentation, to my history. That's one of the reasons. The other reason is just that it is the premier legacy society, and being a member of that is important to pass on to the children in my family.
Now, a lot of people, when they hear the Daughters of the American Revolution, especially when they think of it in relation to people of African descent, their minds are probably going to first go to the story of Marian Anderson and the familiar story that we've heard about the DAR refusing to let Marian Anderson sing at Constitution Hall. So given that, why was it still so important for you to join the DAR? Were those reasons enough, or was there anything else that sort of pushed you?
Marian Anderson sung several times at Constitution Hall. A lot of people don't know that, but the DAR apologized. They offered their space for concerts, and they changed their rule. Their rule was that people of color couldn't perform there, and they changed the rules. So they actually saw their mistake and corrected it. And if Marian Anderson could sing there, certainly I could be a member.
So there's an opportunity then to maybe remind ourselves that just as we wouldn't want to be judged based on the worst things that we've done, just because, all of us have had moments in our lives that we haven't necessarily lived up to our highest standards, maybe we can sort of use the generosity of time to remember that organizations don't always stay the same as they used to stay.
And what a graceful woman. What a great thing to do, to step back from the humiliation of being told she couldn't sing to forgiving them. I mean, who am I? When Marian Anderson could do something like that.
Yeah, that's pretty powerful. And I think you and I both know several other people of African descent who have now been able to authenticate their family histories as well with either the DAR or the Sons of the American Revolution. So there's something really exciting in being able to do that and witnessing the organization change. And also, frankly, just being able to connect the dots between your family and a time so long ago, which, as we know, for so many people of African descent, is a challenge because of the horrors of slavery and the chaos of the Civil War.
Exactly. I probably presented Grant's gift to 5 or 6 chapters of the DAR American Revolution. And these women were very acceptant, asked great questions, were very engaged in the presentation. So yeah, it's not just my history to be narrowed down to a family of African Americans. It is the history as well of the DAR.
Yeah, I think that's pretty fascinating. But let's go back to your family history, because you all have been gathering and preserving these stories for many, 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 many years. Tell us about these images.
Okay, so we have an annual family reunion, and we have had this family reunion as far back as 1905. That's the earliest I can find. The picture back here is the 1912 family reunion. My grandmother also started her own children family reunion, and in 2018, we had the 65th annual family reunion. There are 403 people in this picture, and that's not all of us.
Oh my goodness. I can tell you that my family reunions are not that large, but I don't know, maybe some of you who are watching actually do. So I don't know, type in the chat if you have a family reunion that meets regularly. Maybe you all have massive numbers of people. Let us know. Send a little note in the chat. I think that'd be really interesting to see. And we see that you all are putting some questions in the chat. Go ahead and put more of your questions, more of your comments in there, because we're about to get to a point where we can really dig into some more of those. So as we think about, these opportunities to gather our families, as we think about the research that it took to make sure that we were inviting all the people who should come to these things, to make sure that you could gather all of the material that you needed in order to support your application to the DAR, how do people get started with this? What do you recommend?
We've talked a little bit before about ancestors and elders. So if you don't have any elders, talk to the oldest people in your family. You have an older brother or an older sister. As I said before, they'll remember something that you didn't know that'll be interesting. And then there are birth certificates, marriage certificates, death certificates. And the good thing about the birth certificates and the death certificates is that they have your parents' name on. So that's the next generation. And if you can find how old they are and where they were, you may be able to then find their parents. So I start there. There certainly is Ancestry.com. There's Family Search. There are online services. There's the census that would not only tell you and sometimes who the children were, but the parents, whose household they're living in, how old they were at the time. There are church records.
Well, and I want to lift up the census for a second, because you all know every 10 years, the census people, they put all these questionnaires in the mail. They want to get all up in our business. And some people are like, oh, I don't feel comfortable doing that. That's fine. That's fair. If you do not feel comfortable filling out a census, I will say this, that information goes to helping gather resources for your communities. So it's really, really important to do it. But if you want to set aside that purpose, think about this. 50, 60, 70 years from now in the future, someone's going to be researching you. And that census record is a treasure trove of information for finding out about our ancestors.
It is so much information.
Oh my goodness.
You find that people that you thought were part of your family were living maybe in the same household, but weren't part of your family at all. And they'll be identified.
Also, find other people that you didn't know were a part of your family that are living in your household.
And back then, you didn't move that far away from your family. So if you look at the census and go forward a couple pages or back a couple pages, you may find out on another street you had cousins, or some people have literally found out on a few streets away, there's a whole different family that nobody knew about. So it's a treasure trove. There's just so much information. Yeah. Military records are great. Funeral bulletins list family members, and they give their children, grandchildren, son-in-laws, they list them. That's a great source of information. So there are all kinds of tools out there. You can even Google somebody today, and you'd be surprised what comes up when you Google somebody.
So much information comes up on that. And so speaking of information, we wanted to make sure that everybody gets our contact information. So if you have questions about how to do this research, again, if you have questions about how to order this book, you can see on this slide, we've got Joyce's information, how to buy this book right here, Graham's Gift. You can go to www.joycemosley.com. You can also get it from authorhouse.com and from amazon.com. And I'll let you get it from Joyce.
If you go to my website and send me an email from the website, I can save you some money because I buy them in bulk. So I get a discount, and I'm very happy to pass on that discount.
I bought my copy directly from Joyce. You've also got my contact information on here. As I mentioned, I work at the Museum of the American Revolution right here in Philadelphia at 3rd and Chestnut Streets. And we are really excited to find opportunities to lift up stories of the many diverse people and the many complex stories all about the American Revolution and our ongoing experiment in liberty, equality, and self-government. So if you ever want to chat, feel free to reach out to me at the information below. And then, of course, we cannot leave out the information about the West Philadelphia Cultural Alliance and the amazing Paul Robeson House, which is where we are sitting this afternoon. So you've got all of that information on this slide. And then if we pop over to the next slide, so Joy mentioned a number of types of resources. And so what we put on this slide is a number of locations where you can get those resources. So we're talking about things like the African American Genealogy Group, to which both of us belong as members, but also things like AUGS, the Afro-American Historical and Genealogical Society. The Free Library of Philadelphia has a great webpage for information about doing genealogical research. The National Archives and Records Administration has lots of wonderful information available. The Historical Society of Pennsylvania, so many different places. Now, both of these slides are going to be available on the website for West Philadelphia Cultural Alliance, the Paul Robeson House, but you will also be able to see this whole video, which is being recorded. You'll be able to see it on YouTube, so you can always pause and get all of this information there as well. So Joyce, before we dive into Q&A, and I see people have been dropping really interesting things into the chat, I just want to know, what's next for you? You have a published book. Where do you go from there?
A second book. I'm working on a second book, and right now the working title is Graham's Gift, Lesson 2. And in this book, I have somewhere between 12 and 14 cousins that were enlisted in the United States colored troops in the Civil War. And I'm researching them. Some of them were soldiers and some were sailors. And once this pandemic is over, I can continue my research to finish the book. It's about 80% finished. I just can't get out and get the research.
Yes.
So, but that's next. And then I've got a third story in my head. So this may become a trilogy.
I love it. All of it is just like bubbling forth and overflowing in book form.
It's just, you know, you do some research and you find out things you don't know. Or interesting enough, I have found new relatives because the book and the promotion of the book, I've had people email me to say, my mother was Cyrus Bustill's half-sister, or saying that we're Morays, but we didn't know about the Cremona children. So Richard Moray lived with a woman of color, had 5 children by her, and his wife left him and took their children. And so there's a whole family out there that didn't know we existed. And I showed you that picture where there were 400 of us. So there is lots of interesting information I'm receiving, and more research for me to do.
Well, and that's the beautiful thing about doing genealogical research, and especially once you get to the point of sharing it, is that family members start coming out of the woodwork right? They start to hear you sharing these stories. They start to recognize names and they're like, wait, we have a connection.
Exactly.
And that just helps you go deeper.
Exactly. And so my European ancestors who didn't know we exist are now reaching out to get our story, to complete their story. You know, it completes their family history as well.
That's beautiful. So we've got some questions in the chat. I want to make sure that we get to some of them. So let's see, there's some questions about the artwork of David Bustill Bowser and where it can be found and if it's on display anywhere.
The only place I know right now that's on display is the Union League. And you really have to have a membership or know someone to get in to the Union League to see it. But
do you get to get in to see it?
I have seen it, and at one point, the 127th regimental flag that I said earlier was now in Atlanta, Georgia. It was hanging in Union League, and so I have pictures of my cousins and I standing in front of the flag.
Wow. And it's pretty amazing that that flag still exists because that fabric is still fabric that's been painted over. That's pretty fragile.
It is very fragile. Yeah. And in fact, the 10 other ones were not properly stored. And so they mildewed. At West Point didn't think enough of these flags to properly store them.
Oh, that's heartbreaking. Well, I'm glad that that final one exists. And who knows, maybe some other examples of his artwork will be found in other locations. Maybe not those regimental flags, but maybe other things will pop up. Let's see, some other questions that we see. Is there a particular database that you used in researching your ancestors from the 18th century?
I have used pretty much Ancestry. There are many different online services or databases, but a lot of my information is in Ancestry, and then I move it to Roots Magic on my computer, so I won't lose that information. I also have a external drive that I back up to make sure, because I have lots of pictures, including this picture behind us. And this is kind of my artifact that we ask people to bring artifacts or to share them. And this is the one I want to share. This is the wedding portrait of Hiram and Elizabeth Montier. And for the time period, they were pretty wealthy. Hiram's great-grandfather was Richard Moray, the son of the first mayor of Philadelphia. And when Richard died, he left the family 198 acres of land. And they had trades. Hiram was a bootmaker. And as you can see from the photo, they lived pretty comfortably for that time period, for 1842, to be a person of color. And they owned land, they owned businesses. And so he commissioned these wedding pictures. And we lost them as a family. We didn't know what happened to the wedding pictures. And my cousin was moving, Uncle Joe, who was 92 years old and was moving from his apartment to assisted living. They took the mattress off the bed and there were the portraits. Uncle Joe had been sleeping on the portraits.
Oh my goodness.
For years. We had no idea how long they'd been there. But one of my cousins restored them and they're on loan to the Philadelphia Art Museum. So they've been on loan for about 10 years. They just got restored again because they need, after 10, 12 years, you need to touch them up because they're so old and fragile. And they're in new frames. One of the interesting things is that Elizabeth Brown Montier's portrait was always smaller than Hiram's. And we found out that was because of the frame. The practice back then is the man's picture or portrait was bigger and taller than the woman's.
That's fascinating.
And so, and they did that with a frame. So as you can see, they're the same size. So now they have new frames, and with the new frames, they're the same size.
So a couple of things. So number one, there's actually a documentary that touches on this, right?
You can go to pbs.org and then search For the Montiers, you just put Montier into the search, that's easy. And it's a interesting story of their lives as free people. They built a house off of Limekiln Pike that's still there today. They first built the barn, lived in the barn while they were building the house. And the barn is now a house. Somebody lives there, it's a private residence. And the Montier house is a private residence. Just think about it, it's been there since the early 1800s, 1820, I believe.
It's seen some things. So that was just the first piece. So everybody should watch that documentary because it's really fascinating. But let's also just go back to the story about it being found underneath a mattress. Okay.
It didn't get wrinkled if it was under there. I guess Uncle Joe thought it was a safe place, but then he was like this. So he was 92 years old. He didn't remember where he put him.
So here's what I need everybody at home to do. Take stock of all of the family resources that you have at home. If you've got portraits, if you have photographs, just like document them, make a list, put them somewhere, tell 3 other people where these things are. Do not let them get lost. It is so easy for our history to get lost. So please, if you take nothing else from this experience, just remember that every single one of you is a caretaker for your family's story, right? So what does that mean? What is the responsibility behind that? You are caretakers. Take all the steps you need to.
I would also suggest, in addition to the inventory, that you think about where these artifacts will end up. My family is Howard University, University of Pennsylvania, University of Chicago, because Asala and Carter G. Williamson's information is at the University of Chicago. So think about where you want these to end up, because that's very important. You don't want to lose this information after somebody passes away. You want to be able to have a good system for documenting your artifacts.
Absolutely, absolutely. So speaking of family artifacts, one of the things that we asked you all in the audience to do was to submit some photos of artifacts that you have, family heirlooms that you wanted to tell a bit of a story about. So let's see what we got. Let's see what we received. Do we have any examples of that to show in addition to these amazing portraits? Okay, all right. So it sounds like maybe we have one right here in the Paul Robeson house. So we've got Ms. Vernoka Michael, who's going to come up and tell us a story about an artifact that she's got. And let's see, I don't know, do we have any images or are we just having a bit of a conversation? All right, let's see what we have.
That's it.
So actually, so this is me. So we'll skip mine. Let's see. So what are you going to tell us about?
Well, that's a set that has come down in my family. It was a set of gold ware that belonged to Eleanor Franklin Roosevelt. And I received it from my mother. My mother received it from the Roosevelts because a cup broke. It was a set for 22. It's 22 karat gold. And because it was not a full set, they of course could not use it.
Because one cup broke.
One cup broke.
I'm sure there were 21 guests somewhere who would have loved to eat off of this service.
That's right. That's right. So I've kept it through the years, and I've used it all my life.
So this is the thing. So we all know family members who have like a beautiful set of china that sits in the china cabinet and never ever gets used. So you got an amazing set that came from the Roosevelt family, and you use it regularly.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah.
I love it.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah. And when I was a child, we lived in Poughkeepsie, New York, and Mrs. Roosevelt lived in Hyde Park in this, what we call the cottage. And I had the pleasure of having her as a babysitter.
That's amazing. So you have a deeply personal connection to these items and to the family.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
That's phenomenal. That's fantastic. Thank you for sharing this. This is awesome. I wonder, does anybody, I'm going to check the chat and see if anybody has questions about that. Let's see. Okay, so no questions for that. Let's see, are there any other questions that you all want to drop into the chat? Anything for Ms. Michael? Anything for Ms. Mosley? Yeah, if you've got something that you would like to share, at this point, you can actually go ahead and unmute yourself and you can share and let us know. And while we do that, we've got one more set of objects.
Well, this is an example of something that has come down in my family. Many of the people within my family have been in the ministry. And this is a communion set. Now, many people have never seen this kind of thing. But remember, in my day, in my father's day, the minister always took communion out to the parishioners who may be sick and shut in. And this is one of the sets. This is interesting also because we had the Antique Roadshow here, and many of the volunteers from the Paul Robeson House went down to Delaware for that particular episode. And so this is one of the items that I took down to the Antique Roadshow.
And describe it a little bit for folks who might not be able to see the image as clearly as we can.
All right. There is a silver plate that you have. And in the middle is the actual container that the bread would be put in, that you would serve. And there are about 6 glasses that you have. And when you go out to the person who is sick, you would take not only those items, but you see you have the little canter for the wine. Now, we're Methodists, so we don't actually use wine, we use the grape juice, but that would be stored in there. And of course, you would have your official service that you would have, and then you would, of course, pull out this set to offer your parishioners their communion.
That's pretty fascinating.
And I spent many a day going with my father to commune many of the sick and shut-in. I thought at one time, and I guess my family too, that I would go into the ministry. I didn't go to seminary, but the community ministry is mine.
Yeah, yeah. So number one, I know that to be true because I know so many of the things that you've done in the city of Philadelphia. But I also think what's interesting about what you're describing is that in going out, while this was being taken to folks who were sick and shut in, you were having conversations with those people, which means that you actually are a part of their family stories and you know a bit about their histories. And the reason I looked this up is because when we think about doing genealogical research, we should really think about who are the people outside of our families who know the stories of our families, who are the neighbors, who are the friends, who are the associates, who are the school classmates, and all of those folks who can help you to flesh out your own family history story. So you are a piece of that for so many other people, which is pretty fascinating.
Yes.
Yeah. All right, let's see. Do we have any other questions or comments from Ms. Michael or for anybody up here? All right. It looks like we're pretty good. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you so much for sharing these.
All right.
And so I wonder, should I take a moment to, okay, all right. So it sounds like I've got an opportunity to lift up a couple of objects of my own that I decided to share. So let's see if we go maybe back. We'll see, and no pun intended, a set of my grandmother's bowling pins. Not bowling pins, but bowling pins. I promise you that pun was not intended. So family heirlooms come in all different sizes, right? All different shapes and all different types. So my grandmother, technically she is my step-grandmother. My biological grandmother passed away while my mother was still a child. So my step-grandmother, Doris Elizabeth Reed, who became Doris Shepherd, is actually the only grandmother that I've ever known on that side of the family. And when she passed away, I kept a couple of little things to remind me of her because I love to cook and maybe clearly also love to eat. I have some of her kitchen utensils and things in my own apartment kitchen, but I also have a little baggie that contains probably 30 or more of these pins that you can see on the screen. And it might be difficult to see some of the words that are on these, but for example, this one says Washington, D.C. area WBA. Over here, it says VSWBA Senior Tournament from, what is that, 1993? You've got Washington, D.C. area WBA. You can see there's a Tasmanian devil. He's holding a bowling ball. My grandmother was, to be very brief, an avid bowler. She bowled every weekend. She held parties for people in her league who loved to bowl. She organized tournaments. She organized all sorts of different programs for people who bowled and loved bowling. She was involved in helping youth get involved in bowling. The catchphrase for one of the youth programs was, let's take the kids off the streets and into the alleys, which I find hilarious. And what's so fascinating about this is that my grandmother, she's African-American, and she was born and raised in a time when people of African descent did not have nearly as many opportunities as we have today, which I think we can all argue. Sometimes we don't have nearly as many opportunities as we should have today. And certainly she was not treated on equal footing with people who were not of African descent. My grandmother ended her bowling career as one of the vice presidents of the Washington, D.C. area Women's Bowling Association. She did that, forcing her way and fighting her way through basically every level until the organization and the others that were affiliated with it were willing to invite women of African descent to hold leadership positions. She did not care that people sometimes did not want her in the room. She walked into those rooms anyway. And so each of these tiny little pins, which are the sorts of things you can just clip on a lapel, you can have on a lanyard or something like that, those were a reminder for her of all of the things that she was able to accomplish, all of the people she was able to support, and frankly, all of the fun that she was able to have. And so when I look at the pins in this collection, I just remember my grandmother as a woman who was powerful and who led in many different ways. And through bowling is just one of them, but it had a massive impact for the people that she touched. So that's what I brought. And maybe I should start wearing those sometime soon. All right, well, I think that might be it, unless there's anybody else who has a story that they would like to share. And I'm checking the chat right now just to see, because if not, what I'm going to do is I'm going to turn this over to our friends from the West Philadelphia Cultural Alliance.
One more.
Well, we've got one more. Oh, all right. So, Miss Janice Sykes-Ross, tell me about this beautiful chair.
So this chair has been in our family. I know it goes back to my mother. And I recently just found out that it's a Louis the 16th style chair. We just knew that it was one of the chairs in our family that was in the living room. It always had plastic over it.
I was going to ask if anyone was allowed to sit on it.
No. So I grew up in Columbia, North Carolina, in the South. And most of our furniture that was for company had plastic on it. So we weren't even allowed to go in the room. And we definitely
type yes in the chat if you have ever been in a room like that. I have been in several rooms like that.
So I didn't even realize until very recently what the chair actually looked like without the plastic. It belonged to my mom. And it is one of the most sturdiest chairs in our house. So I'm assuming that it's historic. Of course, it's family value to us. And so she passed it to my older sister. And my sister kept the set. And recently my sister passed away. And so everyone wanted me to take it. So now it's in my care. And I wanted to get it reupholstered, but I don't know. I kind of like that it's in its original format. So that's just a piece that I feel like generationally I could pass on to my nieces and nephews or to my children. So.
And maybe at some point they'll decide to cover it back in
plastic. I think I should put it back in plastic. So. But again, we look forward to hearing from all of you and any stories that you want to share about artifacts or pictures or things that you have. within your family that these two experts should tell us if they're valid. Oh, so we have one more.
All right. We've got a full house here at the Paul Robeson house. I think we've got another. All right.
Yes, I wasn't going to say anything until you mentioned the connection or disconnection between people who are not family members. This is an interesting story. I was a reporter in Macon, Georgia. That's where my family is from. And we were doing a story on Blacks in Macon at the time. You know, I sort of spearheaded that with other Black reporters. And so we were interviewing this man. And so he had photographs that he wanted to show us. And he showed me this photograph, and I'm looking and saying, that's my grandfather. That is my grandfather. I've never seen him as a young man. Next to him is his son, Walter, my uncle. And I don't know if this guy had any information about what this was, but I'm assuming this is like, you know, Future Farmers of America or something like that, because these photos are probably from the 1930s. And so most African Americans in the South, especially around Macon, Georgia, they were farmers. And so this had to be one of their events from Future Farmers of America. But I still have this photograph. And when I got it, I made copies and passed it on to all of my family members, because it was just amazing. You know, as amazing as it was when I was, my family also used to do family reunions. And in 1988, we did a family reunion newspaper. And so one of the most fascinating things for me was to, before the internet, to go down and look at the National Archives that are in Philadelphia, the post office, and in small, not small print, but, you know, in the census, on the census form, handwritten, I saw my grandfather's name when he was like 5 years old. I mean, you know, just amazing. Totally amazing when you discover that type of information about your family members and you see the connection. You know, I was older than he was. You know, all of his brothers and sisters were listed there. You know, this was like the 1900 census. You know, and it was just, you know, it's just breathtaking. You know, it's hard for me to explain the excitement of finding someone who you knew as an adult, to see them as a child growing up in this country. And you know how difficult it was for them back then. But it was great to have that connection, to see that, you know, how they live, a little bit about how they live, the fact that they lived at that point in time, and I could reach back that far to sort of touch that part of my family history.
Yeah, and the beautiful thing, especially about census records, is you can actually access those for free online. If you go to familysearch.org, you can access family, you can find census records going back pretty far in time. So that's definitely a resource. And then because there are so many other resources available through like the National Archives and Records Administration, you can always go onto their website and you can find out when the branch in Philadelphia is open to allowing people to come back in. They're no longer at the space that's downtown at the old post office. Now they're up in the Northeast at Red Lion Road. So go onto the website and see what they have and see if it is worth a visit. I can guarantee you it probably is worth a visit. So what do you think? Prize winning pigs? Possibly. That's a pretty good reference. I feel like you should maybe look for local newspapers or even national African American newspapers and see if there's a photo or a story. Yeah, that ties into this. I think that's pretty amazing. You never know what you will stumble upon. All right, so let's see. It looks like there is a comment. Oh, it is good to ask people you interview if they have anything passed down. That is so true. Yes, every time you talk to somebody, make sure, number one, that you bring them something to show them your appreciation because you're taking up their precious, precious time. But ask them, okay, so what are the stories you have? But also, what are the things you have? People have all sorts of stuff in their attics, in their basement, in shoe boxes that are tucked up on top of a closet, in a bin underneath their bed. You never know what you find. And they might be so used to it being around that they don't think that it's anything special. But for you, that could be the thing that unlocks a piece of information, that unlocks a story, that takes you back a generation, or that gets you someplace that you never knew that you would be when it comes to your research.
One of the things I want to suggest is when you find old pictures, write their names down, because I have so many pictures from the early 1900s. I don't know who's in the pictures. I don't know their names, but start now, capture that information. Somebody in some generation will be able to use that.
Absolutely. And you can find the safest ways to record that name. So for example, you wouldn't necessarily want to write it like in the photo, because that might actually damage the paper and eventually degrade the image. But you can find information online about the best way to label these photos, because there are many things worse, but there are few things worse genealogically than finding a treasure trove of photos and not having any of the people be identified.
Yeah, and that's important. The other thing is be careful how you store your documents. There are ways to store them that keep them safe, keep them from fading. Worth looking into.
Yeah, absolutely. So as we start to reach the end of our program, I wonder if you have any final thoughts that you want to leave anybody with. Is there anything else you'd love to tell us about Graham's gift, which clearly has been passed on to you, or anything else about this research process or your family and connections?
I want to encourage people to learn their history. As I mentioned earlier, people without a history is like a tree without roots. You need to be rooted. Also, during this time when they're trying to erase us from the history, when our history is being separated out as if we didn't contribute, please learn your history. It's great for your kids.
Black history is American history. Absolutely. So remind us again, how can we buy copies of your book?
The easiest way to do it is to go to my website, joycemosley.com, send me an email from that site, and we can make arrangements to get you a book.
All right, that sounds good. So you heard it here, folks. You need to go to Joyce Mosley's website. You need to buy a copy of Graham's gift. You should be researching your own family history. And not only should you be researching it, but you should be thinking about how to share your family history as well.
And this is a good example of how to do that.
So thank you so much for joining us this afternoon. And with that, shall I turn it back over to our friends at the Paul Robeson House?
So I'm Sherry Howard. I am a longtime volunteer at the Paul Robeson House, and I would like to thank.
Oh, you're muted. You're muted. You just unmute for just a second, Sherry. Oh, Sherry, we can't hear you. There we go. Sorry about that.
I'm so sorry about that. I'm Sherry Howard, and I am a longtime volunteer with the Paul Robeson House. I would like to thank our audience for being here today to listen to Joyce tell this remarkable story about her family, and also to Adrienne for being a wonderful conversationalist. You know, it's always exciting when you get people who are talking about things they know about. So Adrienne is so full of information, just as Joyce, about the history of our people in this country. So we didn't have an interview going on. We had a conversation going on. And I'm sure that you learned just as much as I did. I just want to, for those who don't know, that the Robeson House has some projects coming up. October 9th, we have a members exchange going on with the Whitmere Art Museum. And we have the Whitmere has an exhibit of an artist named Roland Ayers, who's from Philadelphia. And Roland did a drawing of Paul Robeson. So the Whitmere Museum has highlighted that portrait. We will have Renoka talking about her Uncle Paul on October 9th at the Whitmere Art Museum. And I am just like Adrienne and Joyce, I am a they're more professional historians. I just like to dig up history. And so I will be here at the museum on October 17th to do a presentation and reading on my book called Art with Heart. It's a book about how I accumulated an art collection by buying cheap at auction. I'm a person who would go to auctions, find interesting things about African-American history, African-American art, come back and write about it in my blog, Auction Finds. 2 events, and you can find out information about both of those events on our website, paulrobesonhouse.org. Again, we'd like for you to buy Joyce's book. You can get it at joycemosley.com, cheaper than you can get it at Amazon. What you end up doing, learn even more about Joyce's historical background. And as for the contact information that we had on the slides and also the list of genealogy resources, we'll have those on the website, so you don't have to worry about writing down or that you missed them. Those are things that we will make available to you. So once again, thank you. And look for your family history. That information is very, very important because through the years, our history was ignored. It was not part of the history book. Now we have the ability to make sure that our family's history and African-American history becomes part of American history, because there's no separation. It didn't happen in a vacuum. So I urge you to talk to your kinfolks, talk to your friends of your kinfolks, go to the census, where you'll find a lot of information about people you may have heard about and just wondering about. So again, thank you. And please be sure to join us October 9th at the Woodmere, in October 1917, thank you, at the, right here at the house. My presentation would be here at the house. All right, thank you, bye-bye.
Thank you all so much for joining us. Have a great afternoon, Sunday afternoon. And this recording will be up on YouTube later for if you would like to share with anyone. And have a great afternoon. See y'all.